Well, good morning and welcome to Primetime at the BU Library. Morning. For those of you that don't remember, I'm Mike Holmes, emeritus around here. I show up once in a while, keep my face in. Primetime celebrates the learning in and beyond the classroom of Bethel faculty, students, and staff in a collaborative project between the Friends of the BU Library, Faculty Development, and other offices on campus. In the next 2 weeks, we'll be celebrating Poetry Month. On Tuesday, April 16th and Thursday, April 18th, the poetry writing class taught by Angela Shannon will be sharing their original work during prime time. And also on April 25th, hosting the annual Bethel community-wide celebration of poetry and words and music. So 3 events coming up there. Today, however, no less poetic in some ways, we welcome Dr. Juan Hernández, Professor of Biblical and Theological Studies and the 2018-2019 recipient of the Faculty Excellence Award for Scholarship. There's a paragraph here that covers it very nicely, but I'm going to tell a couple stories instead about Juan as a scholar. One is his persistence. I first met him when he emailed me out of the blue, as it were, and asked for advice about a dissertation topic. He had asked 4 or 5 of my colleagues that all said no, nothing to be done there. He wanted to work on Revelation, nothing there. It had all been settled. There was a German word by a guy named Schmidt that had answered all questions. I talked to him a bit. We met at a national meeting. He had a few days. I suggested something that was kind of a win-win. If he found evidence, great. If he didn't, he could still get a dissertation out of it. And he went for it because he was persistent in wanting to work on Revelation, which at that time was a backwater in New Testament scholarship. He's persistent. He's also extraordinary in his attention and command of details. As he prepared the research for his dissertation, he kept notebooks of other additional information along the way, developing a resource that no one else in the world had. And then there's his insight, because eventually he came back around to that book by that guy who had answered all questions. It was one he had to read when he did his dissertation, but it was kind of peripheral to what he's mainly doing. Later he had to come back. And it's a book that had been widely praised, but no one had ever really engaged it. If you didn't mention it, you were getting knocked down for not mentioning it, but no one ever engaged it. When Juan finally came back and worked through it, he had the detail in those notebooks of his to understand what was going on and to find the guy's 2 primary weak spots that no one had ever noticed. And at that point he realized it was necessary to really do a revision of it and bring it in English. And eventually he and 2 colleagues put together an English translation of this work by the German fellow with an incredibly insightful introduction that sets the context. It was a bit of a challenge to find a publisher, but just happened to submit it to a series that I edited, so that helped out a little bit. But persistence, attention to detail, insight. Those are for me the things that Juan embodies, and I'm glad to introduce him today to give his lecture for receiving the Faculty Excellence Award for Scholarship.
Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning. Am I using this one? Yeah. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Okay. Good morning. Yeah. All right, good. It's an extraordinary privilege, an honor to be here and to talk about this particular work. As Mike has mentioned, it's something that I have thought about for a long time. It essentially has been a road less traveled. You'll see it as we go through the PowerPoint, but essentially I had thought that this work needed a larger audience. I thought it needed to be translated into English. I thought scholars had not understood it. And when I initially pitched the idea of, hey, let's take a look at this, let's work through it, it was met with a resounding no. Scholars from all across the world. And that kind of has been the case with me. The moment I know something is going to be successful is when I'm told no. The dissertation, which, as Mike mentioned, uses Schmidt. So I'm just going to put it up here. I've got road less traveled. That's kind of a cliche. This is Schmidt, a German Catholic theologian from the, you should say the Nazi era. He was born 1883, lasted till 1975. He wrote this major work on a textual history of the book of Revelation. It was published in 1955, and it is considered a landmark, groundbreaking work on anything you need to know about the text of Revelation. Its manuscripts, its versions, the relationships one to the other. If you go to any commentary here in the library, a commentary, sophisticated commentary, a technical commentary, everybody quotes Schmidt. Everybody quotes his conclusions. Everybody knows his conclusions, right? So it's a groundbreaking work. It's been around for 60 years. I would discover that it had not been read that closely. What ended up happening, by the way, this is contraband, I should say. This picture here, I cut it out of a Festschrift, a library book. I'm here at the library confessing my sins. I cut out his picture, and I actually kept a picture of Schmidt on my desk while I was writing my dissertation, because he has this kind of skeptical look, like, what are you going to do, right? And he is the guy basically that I was referred to when I said I wanted to work on Revelation. I was told, oh, Schmidt already handled all those questions, and I was basically dismissed. Half a dozen international scholars dismissed or ignored me. Mike Holmes was the only one who said, well, let's give it a shot. And of course, this is his work. It took 25 years to produce, right? So this is not, one of the, you wrap up in 2 or 3 years. It was, 2 decades and a half. Okay. Let's see. So a major find. What ended up happening, this was in 2012, I had an opportunity to move on to another career, as it were, or another place. I was at Bethel at the time, and it was a really challenging opportunity. I was invited to go to a Research One university to work there, a tenure track position, and long story short, I knew that I needed to stay at Bethel. It was the right thing to do for me, for my family, for students, and I ended up staying. Well, that summer, 2012, of course, I was depressed over not having to stay at Bethel, but over passing up this opportunity for Research One University. So what I did was essentially throw myself into my work. Schmidt had already been on the radar. I had proposed writing a particular paper in the next SBL meeting, and I was just going to ask some questions about his work, right? But I was depressed. So for 8 hours a day, the summer of 2012, all I did was trudge through the German. Just trudge. And I really had no expectations of finding anything of significance. I thought, at the very least, I'll update his work and probably come up with something. I did not think of a translation. I had no sense that there would be any errors. My thought was simply, hey, we've got new questions today. How does this data look in light of new questions? Well, in the course of doing that, as Mike has mentioned, I had these charts that I had created during my dissertation, 22 files of 5 to 20 pages each of data. This is all manuscript data on the book of Revelation. So I'm using that to compare with Schmidt. As I'm going through his work, I stumble across a major error. And it's smack dab in the middle of the book, and it's in awful German, and you would not know it was an error unless you had been trudging around this thing for, nearly a decade. This was what Schmidt had done. Schmidt, everybody knows Schmidt, those people who do textual criticism of Revelation, for establishing that there are 4 major textual traditions of Revelation, 4 streams, right? Each of those streams is supposed to go back to the 4th century. That's his major thesis, right? Well, I was looking at one of those streams, and I realized that the data for which he argued a 4th century date actually was from the 7th century. He had a 3-century error in his calculation. So in other words, this stream, instead of going back to the 4th century, goes back to the 7th century. It was much, much later. This book had been in print for over 6 decades. It's in German. I don't know if you know any New Testament scholars. They all pride themselves in being able to read German. And somehow, that detail was missed. Right? Nobody had noticed that his dating was off, that he had committed. Now, if he had just a little clerical error, that's one thing, but he pegged on it the entire tradition. So, I'm not a native German speaker. I use a dictionary. I have some German from the PhD program. So I ended up, calling German friends, right? People, scholars in Germany that I knew. And this was very tricky because Schmidt is their man, right? This is kind of their culture, their scholarship. And here's this ghetto-born Puerto Rican in the U.S., Juan Hernández, did Schmidt make an error? It's unthinkable, right? So, they were kind of a little cagey about it. Well, we need to look at it, and let's read it, and is this what you see? And they were kind of, wait and see, maybe, right? And it was a Dutch scholar named Dirk Jonking, right? So not a German, a Dutch scholar, who looked at what I sent. He said, you have not made an error, Schmidt made an error, right? So it was true. I had found this 3-century-old gap, right? So the paper that I had proposed, that's what I just talked about. The paper I had proposed now would turn into not simply, hey, let's see what Schmidt is up to, oh my God, I found something, right? So I go and I give a presentation in 2012 in Chicago at the Society of Biblical Literature meeting. On the spot, get an invitation to go to Germany, all expenses paid, because they want to see a fuller version of what I found, right? While I'm delivering it, one of the top scholars in the world, David Parker, is emailing me while I'm presenting it, saying, this is a major find, right? And this guy he's huge, right? So I'm going through that, right? and then it gets published into an article, a New Testament Studies article, peer-reviewed article, which ends up essentially being a groundbreaking find. And within a year, it's already being quoted and being used in other articles, and people start building on it almost immediately, right? And so, again, all I was trying to do was cope with my depression, right? I wasn't looking for anything. I had no chip on my shoulder about it. I just thought, I got to find a way to put this pain away. And I end up finding this thing, and I'm like, oh my God. And so it dawns on me, right? I think we need a new translation, right? Because I asked myself, what else have we missed? Everybody knows Schmidt's conclusions. Everybody quotes those conclusions. Everybody builds on those conclusions. And now I found that one of those foundational ones is basically built on sand. Is it possible that there are other things there, right? So I started thinking, maybe we should get a translation going in. And there's some thoughts in my head about that. So first of all, I wanted a sense of the whole, right? It's one thing to be able to quote a work and say, hey, here are his 3 points, his conclusion. You can wrap up any book in a page or a paragraph. It's another thing to understand the whole, not just the argument, but basically how it reads, what it's about, right? I mean, you can sum up Augustine, perhaps, in a paragraph, when he talks about, in his book, what's the famous, Confessions, right? Problem of Evil, a few other things, right? And you got it all down, a little essay, right? It's another thing to read through it, to appreciate the language, the culture, the metaphors, all of that. That's a very different thing. And I felt, this work has been in German. Nobody's reading it, not even the Germans, because that was the other thing. And this I was told by Martin Carrere, who runs the Apocalypse Project. He says, we have forgotten our own history, he told me. Right? So it was kind of one of these things that, well, maybe we need a sense of the whole, and a translation would do that. I also thought it needed to be looked at in relationship to contemporary works. In other words, when you look at a particular work in its context, it's not just what the work says, but what it says in light of other works that are circulating at the time. What are other textual critics doing with the book of Revelation or the New Testament? What categories do they use? What themes come up in their work, etc.? What are the antecedents to this particular work? Right? None of these works, no work, it comes up in a vacuum. Right? It inherits a tradition. It follows one. It's on a stream or a conveyor belt of momentum. So Schmidt needed to be looked at in light of prior scholarship, prior German scholarship, current or contemporary, and then also where do we go from Schmidt onward, right? So a translation would allow us to do that. And I won't go into another story, but this actually opened up the door for me to study another scholar, Wilhelm Bousset, and look at his influence on Schmidt. And that was something also that had been forgotten in the history of textual scholarship. So it just kind of opens up all of these new possibilities and interesting things. Okay. And I also thought the work should be reviewed by multiple generations of scholars. Right? So you've got the work and its conclusions, you got the work as a whole, you got the work in relationship to all other works like it, but then you have these scholars who look at a work, read the work, critically assess the work, and come up with particular studies or conclusions, and then people debate them. And there's a whole conversation that develops. And what had happened with Schmidt is no conversation. I mean, like I was told, he settled all the significant questions. In other words, get lost. Right? You don't got to go any further. So I thought a translation would do this. And this is, pay dirt here. a check on ongoing textual work in Germany. Right? In Germany, currently at the Münster Institute in Wuppertal, they are working on a new critical edition of the Book of Revelation. It's going to be the basis, the Greek text basis for all translations in the world. They're reconstructing a new one. They're using the best methods, new theories, material data, etc., images, transcriptions, collations, you name it, everything. And you've got multiple teams working on it. Right? And I thought, what would Schmidt have to say about that work? Right? How does their work today relate to Schmidt? Is there a relationship? And my greatest concern was that the scholarship currently being undertaken there would be created ex nihilo, unmoored and disconnected from Schmidt. And I thought that's dangerous. Why? Because we've already seen that for 6 decades, a 3-century gap error was overlooked. Right? So I decided to talk to the advisory committee. Right? This is the advisory committee for the apocalypse. Not everybody is here. There are a few, so let me just give you a few names, not that you'll remember them. But, Christian Askelin is here. He works on Coptic versions of the Book of Revelation and other works. Kurt Nickham, he works on Ethiopic manuscript, those versions. These are 2 Americans. Darius Mueller here, you'll know him, he's one of my co-translators. He works on everything. He's just a PhD student. He might have gotten his PhD now. But he's published numerous articles, and we're talking about like 100-page articles. It's just the machine. Matthias Geigenfiend, or Fine, a newer member. He's published some things, but I don't know him that well. But you can't get on that committee unless you know what you're doing. Martin Carrere runs the whole thing for Revelation. He gets all the funds through the German scholarships. He's just a jovial, happy-go-lucky figure. You're not your typical austere, mean German, just a bubbly, lovely guy. It was because of him that I've been invited multiple times to Germany to become friends. Klaus Wachtel does a lot of the work at the Münster Institute. He oversees the Editio Critica Major, which are the new critical editions of the New Testament, so the Book of Acts, Mark, and so forth. He also works closely with a new method for analyzing textual relationships in the tradition called the CBGM, the Coherence-Based Genealogical Method. Holger Struckwolf, he is the grand poobah of everything. He runs the Münster Institute, and his name is on everything that gets produced there. And then there's Ulrich Schmidt, no relationship, I'm sad to say, to Joseph Schmidt. I wish I had known. Wonderful scholar, does a lot of stuff on Revelation, a lot of stuff on versions, a lot of stuff on the Septuagint as well. He's cycled out of this committee, but he continues to consult and work. And of course, I got past the guard and I was able to have lunch with these people. So what's interesting is that while initially, my dissertation and so forth was kind of like, you kind of poo-pooed, eventually I got invited into the group to contribute to their conversation. So this was a good place to be. Now, so I emailed the advisory committee and I say, hey, let's do a translation of the Book of Revelation. Now, Schmidt, and I offer basically to do it. I just want 1 or 2 partners. And not all of these people are part of the conversation. There are 2 here, they will not be named, who are part of the conversation, and another one who's not here who's part of the conversation. And my brilliant idea was met with a resounding no, right? They did not want to hear about a translation of Schmidt, right? I put the objection here. It comes from an email in 2013. The person is unnamed. And I've corrected the spelling, so if you see British spelling, you'll know that it's well, it won't be there. I made it American. This is a German scholar, and this is what he says. It's worth reading, just so you can see. And now, these are people that I honor, respect. They're widely published. There's no, you don't want to just ignore them, right? So this was the first thing. It seems like a huge task to think of, let alone produce a translation of Joseph Schmidt's work. Schmidt's work is in many ways not very well fit to be translated. First of all, it includes lots of data that are dated now. That's true. Although I don't think these are bad data at all, it just involves a lot of checking and proofreading, which is kind of ironic, because that's all textual critics do is check and proofreading. But even Schmidt was too much for a German textual critic. He's like, I've got better things to do. In addition, Schmidt is in some ways a typical old-fashioned German scholar. He's German, I guess you can say that, who almost had his feet in the 19th century, right? And that is true. You get to read it, it's true. With his writing style and the way he organizes material. His syntax was so awful that even the German guy we recruited to be on our translation committee could not make heads or tails. I actually had to diagram some of his German sentences to figure out what was what, right? So a German commenting on his German, he was right about this, right? All that seems really different from the Anglo-Saxon way of writing back then and certainly now. I'm really fond of the idea to give Schmidt's work the greatest possible audience, but I wonder if a translation is what is most useful to that effect. Wouldn't it be a very thorny and time-consuming work that can't be done on the side? Of course you hear all that. A deluge of objections from a German about a German work, and you're like, oh, okay, maybe I'll just go jump off a bridge. Objection number 2, so here's from another scholar, if I gave you his name, everybody would know who this is. I don't think I mentioned it already, but he's the same guy who told me Schmidt had solved all the problems already way back. This is what he wrote. Schmidt's work has been very valuable, but why would one want to study the topic today by using someone else's words and structure written several generations ago? Now that's an interesting objection, because I am not advocating translating Schmidt and making him the paradigm for what you're doing. All I want is for Schmidt to be understood on his own terms. But they were looking at this as kind of like, you're just kind of bringing in this guy as like a blast from the past, weekend at Bernie's, and he's going to, tell us what to do. It's not just that the text and text verb, by the way, is this volume. It's major statistical data that arranges manuscripts according to percentages and tries to find out what the relationship is among them. It had not been produced when he wrote this. This was just produced a couple years ago. So they were already anticipating this, and his thoughts about that is that analysis and other aspects of this project may reveal Schmidt's work to contain flaws, or may reveal better approaches. It's also that the picture that will emerge will deserve to be described in terms of contemporary scholarship, because we do not approach the problems and observe the data in the same way. Again, this is all true. This is all true. But none of that is an objection as to why Schmidt should not be understood on his own terms, using his own language. And you may find that what you consider contemporary and new is not, right? That he's saying the same thing you're saying, but in a different way. And that would be very illuminating to us about what we do as humans, right? So that's humanities kind of thing, right? So to link, that's a loaded word. No one is linking, right? But they were just going to stomp on my fingers till I was off the ledge. Such an undertaking as a new edition of Schmidt to the ECM Apocalypse Project does not seem to me a good plan. Describe, use, commend, and criticize his research, yes, but let this project work in its own way and to its own agenda. Right, so that's number 2. And then the death knell. One more objection. This is short and sweet, right to the point, like a nice knife to the chest. I agree. We don't need to produce a new edition of Schmidt's study, but a new edition of the Apocalypse that represents the state of the art of today. I think we should view our ECM project as an independent new approach to the material and not as a second edition of Schmidt's edition of studies. Again, that's not what I was advocating, right? So, needless to say, the people who were most qualified to be my partners in this were not mine. And they weren't kids like me. They had been in the field for 20, 30 years. So this is weighty. This is weighty cubed, right? So that was kind of where we were, 2013. I don't listen, right? I mean, that's, hard-headed. I think Mike mentioned persistence, right? I thought the objections were surmountable, right? So this was just kind of my thought, right? Yes, lots of time-consuming work, dated data, and difficult archaic German style were challenges, but not insurmountable ones. Nor was I advocating his approach, but rather understanding his work. So I realized if you want something done, you got to do it yourself, right? And so I had no contract. I didn't have the copyright, right? Schmidt had died in the 70s. You have to wait 70 years to translate someone's work unless you have the copyright. By the time I was thinking about this, there were 30 years to go, right? So I literally set out to translating it with no hope of ever seeing it published. I was doing it for myself. So, armed with coffee, and coffee beans covered in chocolate. This is a Schmidt's work, by the way. This is also contraband, I should tell you, because I went to print services and had them photocopy the whole book for me. You can't do that nowadays. I don't know what's happening in America. But so I was able to take the pages apart and just work through it, right? And this was a very time-consuming labor. You know, a year had passed, and it wasn't until the summer of 2015 that I said, okay, I'm going to do this, right? And I put my daughter in a bunch of camps that summer, made sure she was, you know, having fun. And I would go to Starbucks or Caribou, and for 8 hours, not unlike 2012 where I found the mistake, now for 8 hours I was just working through a translation. And again, it's work. I mean, it's German. I'm not a native German speaker. I know a little bit. I use a dictionary. Google Translate is, you just kind of work through it, right? So that summer, I worked through the entire thing. It's 250 pages, 251 pages to be exact. And so I come to school in the fall. Mike is still there. Mike's my constant companion, buddy, and mentor. And so I'm at my desk, and my translation is this big binder, right? Just this thick binder. And so I come into the office after doing all that work, a few days, and I look at that thing, and I'm like, geez, wouldn't it be great if we could publish this? I mean, it's a lot of work. Like, I was committed to knowing the work, irrespective of what may come, right? So it was valuable to have it, because that would shape my scholarship, my thinking about the manuscript tradition, right? In a way that perhaps others had not been shaped. It was a kind of ace in a hole. But boy, wouldn't it be great to get it out there, right? So I walk over to Mike's office right next door to me, and I said, Mike, you take a look at this. I show him the binder, and I'm like, if I were able to get a couple of scholars to join me, because I wasn't going to give up. I mean, not after all that. Where there's a sense in which you create your own momentum. Like I didn't plan to do this, but when I saw it, I was like, maybe I should do this, right? I said, if I could get a couple of other partners to work with me on this, because it's already done, and bring it up to publication standard, would the series that you work with, and it's specifically a text critical series, the Society of Biblical Literature, right? You think they'd be interested in this? And Mike's like, of course, right? So Mike, again, I'm glad he introduced, this is a second time that he endorses one of my fool's errands, right? And he says, sure. Now, Mike is also very wise. He's a company man, right? So he didn't promise me anything. He basically says, produce it, and then contract comes later, but we'll have to have a copyright. So it's not like he was giving me anything other than a go ahead, right? And but that's all you need. That's all you need. And he had more hope in the project than I did, because when we were waiting for the copyright, I just thought we were just never going to get this, and it's just one of the most tragic stories. Blah blah blah. Okay, so I get to working, right, and I approach this. So that's fall 2015. I approach two young scholars. Look at these young bucks, right? just studs, right? So Garrick Allen. Garrick Allen is a New Testament scholar. He's a young New Testament scholar. He was doing a postdoc at Wuppertal, where they were working on critical edition of Revelation. He's American, but fluent in German, right? And he was in Germany with his wife and his kid, working on a postdoc where Martin Carrere teaches, right? This institute. And then Darius Mueller is even younger. He's the guy who's published so many articles, lengthy, just about everything. A PhD student, might be done now. Full-blooded German, right? And you hear him speak in English, you know he's German, right? So that's his first language. So I approached these two guys at the Society of Biblical Literature meeting in Chicago, I think, in 2015, and I show them the translation, and I say, look, I just need somebody to go over it with me, clean it up, bring it up to snuff, we'll write a critical edition, right, etc. And I promised them immortality. Right? I said, if you join me on this, and we actually publish it, your names will forever be associated with Joseph Schmidt, right? And this, again, he's the big guy, right? Full of spit and vinegar, they jumped at it. Like, oh yeah, let's do it. And, they probably assumed that it was going to be easy. I don't know. But they are textual critics. They very detail oriented, no languages. I mean, the space we covered, right? So we set up a little process starting 2016 January, where we divided the book up into thirds, right? Thirds, 250 divided into thirds, right? I would revise a third of the translation, my translation. Then I would send copies to each one of them independently. They would then comment on it, make revisions, while I worked on the second third. And then I'd send the second third, and they'd send that back to me. I'd do the third, and we went round and round and round and round over 15 months. I mean, countless times, leaving each other notes, working through the material. And again, they were just diligent, cooperative. It was very congenial to work with them. They respected the process. And by the way, at the time I'm doing this, I'm sending copies to the advisory committee to kind of, this is what we're doing, this is what we're doing. Letting them see it, letting them know this is going on, right? And so we worked through it, and all the while we're waiting for word about the copyright. Schmidt's dead, the publishing house was gone, right? So how are you going to get the copyright? Bob Bowler of the editorial board is the one who's looking for this. And as we get closer to being done and writing the introduction, and it starts feeling finished, and it starts feeling beautiful, right? Like we got a foundation for something groundbreaking, something worth being in print. I'm going into a greater and greater panic about not getting the copyright. Because I mean, then you really, I mean, it was literally, you know, like a fight to the death. Somebody's going to die in this battle. Right? It's either the copyright's going to be given to me or I'm going to be a goner, right? That's how this ends. And so we're waiting that entire year and a half that we're working, and we finish in March 2017, and it's in June 2017 that Mike gives me a call. Mike never calls me, by the way, right? We just email or we see each other, and he certainly doesn't call at night. But he called at night to tell me we got the copyright. Right? Wow. And what ended up happening was that Bob Bowler searched high and low for, I mean, you know, Joseph Schmidt was a priest, he had no offspring that we know of, right? So, you know, who has it? You know, the school didn't have it, the publishing house didn't have it, he of course is gone, right? And they managed to find it with someone who was at a monastery. And the guy, when he found that we were looking for the copyright for this to provide a translation, not only gave it to us with his blessing. Just handed it to us. And then I got the contract, and within a year, it was published. Right? Now, these guys did stellar work, but I also had some help from students. One of them was Grace Shaw. I don't know if you guys know Grace Shaw. Miss Shaw, I call her. Her dad works here, I think, right? I think everybody knows that. She was one of my top Greek students, advanced Greek translation and readings of New Testament Greek. She went through and viciously edited the Greek in our manuscript. This is her work. Look what she did. She color-coded little tabs. I mean, she just wrote on everything. She found errors that none of us found. You're talking about 3 New Testament scholars who read Greek like it's nobody's business, and she's spotting things left and right. I mean, she saved us from a multitude of problems. Might have been behind an 8 ball if it weren't for her, right? So she helped us with that. Gary Long also. I actually had to bribe Gary Long to help me. I told him, look, Gary, because Gary's very, very finicky when it comes to language, right? Syntax and grammar and all that in English. So I said, look, I'm going to hand you 50 pages. And for every 50 pages you review, I'll take you to lunch, right? So I ended up taking him to 5 lunches. I don't know how much that costed me. But, you know, we managed to get him to get on board and work. So I've given thanks to these people for their work. And the product, of course, is it's published July 2018. I mean, it's just available, right? And what's extraordinary, to me at least, is once I translated it, and again, it was just me and the 3 guys, I got a sense of the whole. Like I started to see things that I had not seen. I have been working with Schmidt since 2003. Once it was in English, I started to see things I had not seen before. And I'm not talking about little errors or this and that. I'm talking about just the sense of where he's headed, what's going on. I started to see its relationship to other works. In other words, the thing that I projected others might be able to see, I was the first one to see them. And it was extraordinarily gratifying and illuminating, right? And it confirmed, of course, that this is what we needed to do, right? I'm not taking over anybody else's project. It's a Schmidt thing, right? Okay, so this is, so it finally comes out. Can't believe it. And then, 2 months later, I get to present on it in Athens, Greece, right? Now this picture, to me, represents exactly what I wanted, right? Because what did I want? I wanted Schmidt to be part of the conversation. I wanted his work to weigh in on current work, right? So this is the Society of New Testament Study meeting in Athens, Greece. It's in August of 2018. And around the table, you basically have world-class scholars, textual critics, right? Klaus Wachtel, right? He runs the thing, right, out of the Munster Institute, all these ECM projects, right? At one point, he asks, what do you think Schmidt would think about the reconstruction of the Greek text of Revelation, a new one that much needs to be changed? And I was able to stand up. There's actually footage of this on Facebook somewhere. I was able to pick up Schmidt's book, turn to the last page, and read to him as if Schmidt had been summoned from the grave, and speak to his later German compatriot and say, this is what I think you're going to find and what you're not going to find. I just read it to him. I mean, it was like an incarnation. You couldn't get any better than that. It was just a dream come true, right? You have Jennifer Knus. She's at Duke University, textual critic, just wrote a major work on the woman caught in adultery. Of course, there's Mike Holmes, my constant traveling companion. Christina Kreiniger, a papyrologist. Juan Chapa, another Juan. There is another Juan out there in textual criticism. Another papyrologist from Spain. Foster, New Testament critic, a New Testament scholar. Martin Carrere, of course. Dan Wallace, the Dallas Theological Seminary, does a lot with images and textual criticism as well. So again, it's as if everything just started falling into place, right? For the most improbable beginnings. Okay, so what are the contributions of the book, right? And these are things that you just kind of pick up on. There's a lot that can be said. I won't say it all, but I'm just going to run through them, and then we'll have some time for questions. Number one, it's available in English for the first time. I mean, that itself is a contribution, and we can have the critical engagement that the work has not received in 60 years. Now, it is my opinion that despite the fact that I was able to spot a few flaws here and there, on the whole, the thing is still a landmark work and a major voice in the discipline. So you ignore it at your peril if you're working on Revelation. You get a clearer sense of Schmidt's textual reconstruction. He does not reconstruct the text of Revelation per se, but he lays the groundwork, the relationships among all the different families of manuscripts. This is probably more than you'll ever want to know in your life, but these are kind of the hierarchy of things. You've got your original text, of course, which is now lost. You've got an archetype, which is kind of a second layer of the tradition that has to be reconstructed. This also is lost. Then you have sub-archetypes. Every archetype breaks down into several little lines, right, as it descends. This also has to be reconstructed, all of these. And then you finally have some text forms, groups, and families, and what these are basically are manuscripts that have certain characteristics, and they're grouped in one family versus another. You've got multiple of those, some large, some small. You got cross-pollination among text forms, groups, and families. What does that mean? Basically that, you know, one manuscript gets copied into another, and the characteristics change, right? And then finally, scribal activity at every level. In other words, scribes, as they're copying, they're making errors, they're making changes, and that occurs at every level following the original text. So you have a very clear sense of how the book of Revelation, in his reconstruction, developed, and why it is that the text looks the way it does, right? So this is just something, these are not conclusions that he lays out. These are derived just from reading the work and seeing how his categories are working. There has been no discussion of this in the field today, so that's a new thing. Contributions 3 to 4, it's a transitional work, and this is important because Schmidt's work was seen as final. He had conclusions. This is the landmark work. When you look at it in context, you realize, no, it's kind of like in a hinge. It's kind of lurching towards a new way of approaching the data and is not quite successful at getting there, right? Again, something that hasn't been talked about. This is just a few bits about that. He moves away from a confident and classic reconstruction of the textual tradition. There was a time where textual critics were very confident about how they could reconstruct the text, reconstruct the relationships of manuscripts, right? He starts out with that kind of approach. By the time he ends, he moves towards the recognition of contamination in the textual tradition. In other words, it's not so easy to piece together the manuscripts like a puzzle, say this one influenced this one, influenced this one. It's possible that one particular scribe used two different manuscripts and introduced mixture. If you've got mixture in a manuscript, that's what they call contamination, it's a lot harder to kind of go back to the pathway towards an original. So he recognizes this in some of the tradition. So Schmidt's study, and again, this is not a conclusion you'll find anywhere, but we can witness it in his work. He encounters the problem of contamination, and he anticipates the needs for newer approaches. The entire approach today, contamination is the big buzzword. Everybody's talking about contamination, and all the methods that are developed are about tackling contamination. And what we notice in Schmidt is that he is on the precipice, right? He starts with an old way of looking at the material, looks at it, and then empirically says, no, there's contamination, and he does the best he can, right? That's pretty darn good what he does, and I think it's not going to be shaken that easily, but you essentially have someone who almost clairvoyantly has crossed this threshold and is already aware of where we are in the 21st century. Again, that's not something he highlights. You can only get that by looking at his work. Number 5, it gives us an opportunity for comparison. So this is the new work that I just talked about, text and text work that analyzes the manuscript. Now you can compare something like this with Schmidt's work. Material, theories, methods, conclusions, continuities, discontinuities. And at the end of the day, what does this produce? Literacy. You have literacy about the tradition, literacy about what scholars do, their histories, etc. So it's more than just what's the original text. Right? There's more going on here. Okay, advisory committee, change of heart, right? What, you know how when I say success is, failure is an orphan, success has many fathers? I kind of remember that, right? Okay, so I thought it would be fun to go back and look at the emails I got from the original objectors after it was produced, right? And very grateful that it was positive, right? And I give a lot of credit to these guys. They've been nothing but supportive, but they have views that are tied to their methods and their approaches and their traditions, and they're legitimate. They're absolutely legitimate, but they're no substitute for having Schmidt enter the conversation. So, objector number 1, congratulations to you, blah, blah, blah. Great achievement. I have some idea about the time and effort it took. Why? Because I kept sending him copies, and copies, and copies, and copies. And Darius works with this guy. I know that you, Juan, have long been incubating this. I mean, I never stopped talking about it, despite the fact that everybody said no. It must be so rewarding to finally see this tangible result. Well done, and thanks a lot. So again, it's just extraordinarily gratifying, not for me, but for Schmidt. That voice is out there and it's recognized. Second objector, congratulations, this is an excellent achievement. We'll open up this material to a wider audience. Look forward to seeing it. And then the gentleman who gave the death knell, right? Congratulations. Now I hope J. Schmidt will get the reception in the English-speaking world he deserves. That was from Mr. Death Knell, right? So at the end of the day, all I can say is I'm extraordinarily grateful for any number of things, but first of all, being depressed, right? Having to throw myself into work, having the support of Mike Holmes, and even the objections that really just kind of push you in another direction. Finding something that you didn't seek out to find, right? And I've had a picture of Schmidt with me since Emory, since my PhD.
2 foot by 3 foot picture.
Oh, now he's 2 foot by 3 foot. I had a little thing, but now it's 2 feet. He comes to my office, just this big. It's kind of like a Teen Idol poster, but a dead German. So, no surprise, I consider him my patron saint. Thank you. Any questions? We'll take them. About 10 minutes.
Wow.
Yes, sir.
Most of this stuff has been in German. How much is happening elsewhere in the world?
Well, a lot of the work continues to be out of Germany, but they really do have an international cast of scholars. So a lot of the volumes they produce that are like this will have German and English articles. Occasionally you'll find an Italian one. A lot of Americans are also working with the Münster Institute as well, whose language is primarily English. As far as the state-of-the-art reconstruction of the text of Revelation, it's housed there, but you have a lot of other languages or other people who speak different languages involved in producing their results in those languages. But it's still largely German. Wuppertal, which produces these volumes, it's like every couple years they produce another one of these volumes, and basically their ongoing work, most of those are in German. So it's still, I mean, the irony is that Schmidt now will circulate widely, be better understood, and can be used for comparison with these German works, but that's still an obstacle. You know, again, not for them, but for a lot of English speakers.
Were there any parts of his work that you felt like with the archaic German didn't come through in English very well, so somebody reading that wouldn't be able to get at him as well as you'd hope?
Yeah, and again, this was the helpful thing of doing it multiple times over and over with two other people. You get a clearer and clearer sense. So, you know, for example, if you come across a particular construction, you're like, you know, this is not even a human construction. I don't even know what he's saying, right? If you have a sense of the whole, you kind of, I think this is what he means. So it's greater than the total of its parts, right? So yeah, there were a few passages exactly like that, and you know, we even got into debates about it. And in the editing process, while we were finalizing everything, there was a sentence that almost went into print. That when I read it, and it was kind of a last minute, let me just look at it one last time. You know, I half told myself, you don't have to do it. I looked at it, and it made no English sense, right? So that was always so you can make errors in the Greek. You can make errors in the citation of the manuscripts. You can make errors in the translation of the German. You can make errors just in English. Just think about in English. We got to edit our papers. That is the easiest thing to do. There are half a dozen opportunities for errors on every page, right? So the gentleman who said that's a lot of work, he was absolutely right. It just took someone who was foolish and said, I don't care, right? And there were some days where I was like, Lord, really? Is this what it amounts to? Yeah.
How do you think Schmidt initially missed his error?
Actually, what he did, he mistranslated a page out of Milne and Skeat. Milne and Skeat is a work from the 1930s that analyzes Codex Sinaiticus, a 4th century Greek manuscript. And he makes some claims there about the different correctors, right? And Schmidt cites Milne and Skeat for the 4th century date, right? I went to the page, and there's nothing about that 4th century date, right? So it was basically based off a misunderstanding or mistranslation of Milne and Skeat's work, but it was compounded by the fact that he changed also the use of the symbols, Schmidt did, to try to make things clearer. And that is basically what threw a lot of people off the scent of the error, because he had altered the way he identified the material. People didn't even know that he was talking about something different than what they thought, right? So it was like a perfect storm, because most people are not experts in Revelation. There are only a few that are experts in Revelation, right? So anything he says about Revelation, well, it doesn't matter. So the error goes unnoticed. And the people who know Revelation may not be aware that he's changed his labels, right? The only one who had a sense that Schmidt had an error was Caldwell, a scholar from the early part of the 20th century, a textual critic. He suspected that Schmidt's discussion of Andreas being a 4th century product was wrong, but he didn't identify why it was wrong. He just thought, based on his understanding of the larger tradition, that needs to be double checked, he thought. But he didn't realize that he was right, but it was for a different reason. It was because of the data he was using, Schmidt, not just because of Caldwell's view of the textual tradition. Yeah.
What are the implications for other areas of New Testament textual scholarship?
Well, I mean, I think, just so many directions you can go to. There's usually this mantra about dead white males, right? Dead white male scholarship, what do they have to offer? As an historian, you cannot afford to overlook this stuff, right? So first of all, you need to go back to the primary sources. You need to engage the leaders in the field. And also, perhaps most importantly, do not take the judgments of others as final until you assess the work yourself. Because right after I found Schmidt's mistake, I went back another century, to the 19th century, and started to analyze Wilhelm Bousset. Wilhelm Bousset actually was correct in ways that Schmidt was wrong. And Schmidt misunderstood him as well. So there's a lot of scholarship out there that is based off of foundational works that you only know them in summary, you only know them in reference. Who has the time for all of that? But at the end of the day, if you are committed to literacy, you'll want to explore all of that. And I think there are things in New Testament. New Testament is changing all over the place in so many different ways. It's because people are looking at this stuff afresh.
So has this made a difference
This
in scholarship?
this translation?
Yes.
Well, it just came out. No. Well, I'll tell you what. One of the things that I did recently was take a look at this work, and I looked at its conclusions, and it was really interesting that some of the things that were being said here were anticipated here, right? Some of the things that were said here also seem to misunderstand or misrepresent what's said here, right? That I caught. And also, there are ways in which this supersedes anything that Schmidt could have done, right? I mean, this is an indispensable work. I mean, if you look at it, look at this is like, 10,000% mathematics. It's just data. Next November, I'm writing a paper comparing both of these. So that'll be my first attempt to have these two in actual conversation. And there's no doubt that this is an advance, but it is not a replacement, right? And that in itself is a contribution, because before it was, well, we don't even need to translate him. We already know what he's about. That's not the case.
There's one.
Yes? Where? Oh.
Juan, what got you interested in Revelation to begin with? It's such a weird book, and it's so disturbing.
Yeah.
He's a crazy Pentecostal preacher.
That's right. Well, the Pentecostal roots. You can blame the Pentecostal roots. It's interesting because the irony is I'm not interested in Revelation in the traditional ways.
Yeah.
Like, I don't care about the rapture. I don't care about the beast or the Antichrist or the millennium or all of those views. Like, to me, it's like a big snore fest, that stuff. But I love detail. I love complexity. I love mystery. And the textual tradition offers that. I mean, only Germans go there, right? That's the tradition. It's the way its manuscripts are arranged and copied is very different from the rest of the New Testament. And it also seemed to me to be a neglected area. So it was more about kind of finding something that clicked all of those needs I had for a story, for detail, for mystery, pulling it out of the darkness, making it clear. I'm very resistant to trends, right? And all the trends were going in a different direction. And I'm like, well, what about this? Like, what originally got me interested when I came to Mike at Emory was there were several publications about the New Testament tradition on Paul or on the book of Luke about how scribes corrupted the scriptures. The scribes were changing things left and right. Nobody was talking about Revelation. I thought Revelation has a checkered past. Everybody knows Revelation had trouble getting into the canon, right? Why isn't anybody asking about whether scribes mucked around in there a little bit, right? And that was my question. And when I started asking that, the answer was Schmidt solved all those problems, right? So it was a lot of those things. But yeah, I mean, I do teach Revelation, as you know, in these conferences and whatnot, and I do all the traditional stuff. But that is not what gets me going. It's the mystery the unknown about the tradition.
Yeah.
I think we have 30 seconds. Okay. Thanks so much.